Well, as I was saying, I invite you to open the book of Psalms with Psalm number 4. It's a very brief psalm, and we're going to call this psalm a day in the life of a man of God. I explained to you last week that some psalms have been written because of things which happened in David's life. Well, not only David, other psalmists wrote psalms. Some psalms have not been written because of any particular occasion in the life of David. This is one of them. We don't know when he wrote this one, or why he wrote it, or in what circumstances, or whether he was alone, or what was happening, or who he was with. And you'll see, if you look at the introduction to Psalm 4, that it's to the chief musician with stringed instruments. Here was a psalm which was sung in the temple. The temple had a choir. The choir sang psalms, and these psalms which were sung in the temple were expected to reflect the experience of most believers. So if you are a true believer, you can probably say about this psalm, that's really mine. I can identify with that. That expresses my experience. That speaks for me. Now, why are we going to call this psalm a day in the life of a man of God? Well, if you look at the psalm, David starts the psalm alone. We'll look at this in more detail in a moment. And then the body of the psalm is David speaking to unbelievers. And then you will have noticed at the end of the psalm, here is David alone again, and he's getting ready to go to bed. When do you mix with unbelievers? During the day. When do you go to bed? Obviously in the evening. And therefore it's not too much of a stretch of the imagination to believe that this opening verse, where David is alone, is David talking to God before the day begins. I don't think that we're stretching things, therefore, if we can say, this is a day in the life of a man of God. And the question obviously is going to be, is this your day? Well, let's look at verse 1, because the psalm divides into three. David alone, David with others, and David alone again, at the end of the day. We'll read verse 1. Hear me when I call, O God of my righteousness. You have relieved me when I was in distress. Have mercy on me and hear my prayer. As the day begins, David is talking to God. How does he see God? How do you see God? As he thinks of praying to God and begins his prayer, what are the great thoughts which come immediately to his mind? Now, first of all, you've noticed that he says, O God of my righteousness. He's very, very well aware as he comes to God that he, David, has no right to come to God, that he hasn't anything to offer God. He's got no righteousness which will please God. He hasn't got any reputation to his credit. He's too well aware, as we all are, of his sins. Perhaps he's writing this psalm after he'd committed that awful sin with Bathsheba and arranged the murder of Bathsheba's husband. Perhaps he's come to this psalm after one of the other great failures of his life. And he's very well aware that if he's going to be accepted by God at all, it's got to be God who gives him the righteousness, because he himself hasn't got any to come into the presence of God. That's how a believer speaks. And that's where the gospel starts. I didn't do it very well, but on Thursday I was trying to explain to those who came to the family night a little bit about Martin Luther. Poor Martin Luther. He slept on uncomfortable beds. He ate nothing but porridge. I like porridge, but I wouldn't like to live on it. He whipped himself. He stayed up long hours and went without sleep. He worked very hard. He wore uncomfortable clothes. He deliberately endured the cold, because somehow or other he thought that he could earn God's favour. Somehow he could persuade God to be interested in him. That somehow he could be worthy of God and God would let him in. And years went by before he understood the truth. And then came that wonderful day, didn't it, when he was in the tower at Wittenberg. And he read that lovely verse, the just shall live by faith. In other words, we don't ever have to earn our way into God's favour. God himself gives us his favour. He himself gives us the righteousness which we haven't got. And it becomes ours by faith. And of course, as New Testament believers, we understand it. We understand that Jesus Christ didn't only die for us, He lived for us. That those events which took place in Palestine 2,000 years ago are saving events. In the very place of temptation where we failed, Jesus Christ didn't fail. And that's precisely the righteousness which God gives us as Christian believers. David doesn't see that as clearly as we do, because he's an Old Testament believer, but he sees it nonetheless. Do you see it? When you come in prayer, are you aware that God is the God of righteousness, and He gives you a righteousness which lets you in to His favour, into communion and fellowship with Him? Now you'll also have noticed that he says to God, "You have relieved me when I was in distress." He can look back at a time when he was rescued. And as we work through the Psalms, we're not going to work through all 150 immediately. If we live long enough, we will. But if we work through the Psalms, we find again and again and again and again, David looks back to a time when he was rescued. On one great occasion, he describes himself as being down in a great pit, and there was mud at the bottom, and the sides were steep, and he couldn't get out, and he was sinking further and further in. Well, that's the situation of all of us before our conversion. We are lost, and we can't do anything about it, and we can't get ourselves out of the mess that we're in. But there he says that the Lord took him out. The Lord reached down and took him out. And one of the glorious things of the Christian life is that we can look back, can't we? And we can look back and we can say, it's coming in French again. Sorry about that. We can say, beforehand, in the old days, I was like that, but now. And we can look back to a time of rescue. A time when we were lost and saved. A time when we were blind and came to see. A time when we were dead and we were brought to life. A time when we were far away and we were brought near. A time when we were on the road to hell and now we're on the road to heaven. And as we come into prayer, it comes into our mind that we weren't always like this. You have relieved me when I was in distress. That's how David sees God. And look what he prays as the day begins. Hear me when I call. There it is in verse 1. And at the end of the same verse, hear my prayer. Oh Lord, he's saying, as the day begins, God of my righteousness, God who saved me, the thing that I want as the day begins is I want you to hear me. I want to know that I'm in fellowship with heaven. I want to know that you're listening to me. I want to go into the day with you. I want to go into the day in communion with God. Hear my prayer. And on what basis does he pray that prayer? Well, look at the end of verse 1 again. Have mercy on me and hear my prayer. Sometimes we fall into the error, don't we, of thinking, well, we've been Christians a few months or a few years, and somehow or other we've come to the point where we deserve God's favour. We didn't deserve God's favour when we were initially saved, and we don't deserve it now. And somehow we kid ourselves into thinking that we're stronger than we used to be, and we're better than we used to be. But we're not. And if it wasn't God's mercy, His sheer, undeserved, unearned kindness, then we would be the most lost of all men and women and young people. I want to ask you tonight whether David's God is your God. When you come into prayer, can you rejoice that God's righteousness is on your account? When you come into prayer, can you think back to the time when God rescued you through Christ's cross? And when you come into prayer, it's your great, earnest hunger that you should have fellowship and communion with God. And as you come in prayer, do you plead anything that you've got? Or do you just rely upon God's mercy? Because this is the God of the Bible, and this is biblical prayer. And anything else is a stranger to what the Bible teaches. So we start the psalm, and David starts his day alone. Now please look at verses 2 to 5. We can't live alone. The Bible doesn't encourage us to do so. All through church history, there are some people who've thought that they would be better Christians if they could be alone. They've gone away onto deserted islands. Some of them have even lived on the top of pillars for years on end, so they could have very little contact with anybody. Amazing things people have done because they thought somehow if they could withdraw from everybody else, they would be holy. There are times to withdraw. We've already talked about one. But we have to live in a real world. And the vast majority of people, and I do mean the vast majority, are not Christians. The vast majority of your neighbours are not Christians. The vast majority of people in the place where you study are not true believers. The vast majority of people in this city are not Christians. Well, David goes into his day, and even though he's the king of Israel, he realizes that the people around him, for the most part, are not true believers. And he speaks to them. Do you speak to unbelievers? First of all, he talks to them about the way they're living. Do you do that? Then he talks to them about how wonderful it is to be a believer. Do you do that? And then he tries to persuade them not to be any longer what they are and to become what he is. Let's see that in the psalm. Look at verse 2. Here he protests at the way that unconverted people are living. How long, O you sons of men, will you turn my glory to shame? How long will you love worthlessness and seek falsehood? What does that mean? How long, O you sons of men, will you turn my glory to shame? What is the glory of the believer? The glory of the believer is that he knows God. That is his greatest treasure. You can find out what a person's greatest treasure is quite easily. Ask them, if they had to lose everything, what is the last thing that they would hold on to? What is the last thing you would hold on to? You could cut out that, and you could live without that, and you could live without that. But what is the last thing that you would give up if you had to give up everything? And a true believer has no problem answering that. The last thing I would give up is knowing God through Jesus Christ. That's our glory. But the unconverted world, they mock that idea. They skit, and we become the object of all sorts of jokes. The unconverted think that we're cranks and that we're crazy, or that they label us fanatics. And sometimes they say we've got religious mania. And what is our glory, and what is the thing which is the most wonderful thing of all to us, to them, it's contemptuous. And they turn our glory into shame. Why? How long are you going to be like that, says David. He goes on, how long will you love worthlessness? Ladies and gentlemen, when we come to the judgment seat of God, what's going to count? Will the possessions that we've got, the very latest, be worth anything then? Now, the Bible isn't against these comforts, but we've got to keep them in their place. And we're certainly not to fall in love with them. The fact that you've drunk 5,000 gallons of alcohol, or however many it is, will that count when you come to God's judgment seat? The fact that you put a needle into your veins and put chemicals there to make you feel different, will that count when you come into God's judgment? That you've been to certain places and had certain pleasures, or been noticed in a certain circle? How long will you love worthlessness? But the great characteristic of unconverted people is that they think about that, and they think about that, and they think about that, and they think about that, but they forget this great judgment of God. And they set their affection upon things which at the end of the day they're not worth anything. They're useful and comfortable for this life, some of those things are wretchedly horrible. But unconverted people love them. How long are you going to go on being like that, says David? That's the way you're living. How long will it go on? And he goes on, how long will you love worthlessness and seek falsehood? Unfortunately, unconverted people seek falsehood. They believe many lies. Many lies. They believe, for example, for the most part, that all religions are equally valid. That's not true. They believe that the Bible contains contradictions. That's not true. They believe that folk who go to church are hypocrites. That's sometimes true, but not always true. They believe all sorts of lies. And they seek them and promote them. And you know in this dreadful world how much untruth there is. How much plain, barefaced lying. How much deceit. How much trickery. And many people seek that. How long, says David, how long will you do this? Will you never ever be wise? So this man has been alone with God, comes into the world, and he talks to unconverted people about what they're like. And then he shows them how wonderful it is to be a believer. Verse 3 is a lovely verse. But know that the Lord has set apart for himself him who is godly. The Lord will hear when I call to him. Why are you different? What makes you different as a believer? It's the action of God. God has set apart certain people. They're different. Now, we didn't know when we first became Christians that God had set us apart in his eternal plan and choice. We didn't know anything about that. And we didn't know when we first became Christians that Jesus Christ had died for us and had actually borne the punishment of our personal sins. We didn't know that. What we did know was that when the gospel went out to a group of people, it didn't touch everybody, but it did touch us. And that when everybody else only heard the voice of the preacher, we heard the voice of God. And that when other people stayed as they were, we repented. And when others wouldn't believe, we came to believe. And when others wouldn't and couldn't see, we saw. And the Lord did it. And we don't know why he did it in us and not in others. And we could never have dreamed at that moment it was all part of an eternal plan. But what makes us different is that the Lord has set us apart. It's wonderful to be a Christian. There's this great human race, and the Lord has set some of the people in it apart. We're the most privileged people in the world. We're God's people. He's loved us, and he's set us apart. It's not just a theory. It's actually happened in our experience as the gospel was explained and announced. And we now know from this verse why God did it. The Lord has set apart for himself. There it is. The Lord has set apart for himself. He set us apart to save us from hell, yes. He set us apart because he'd already given us to Christ. Wonderful. He set us apart for himself, that we might know him and love him and enjoy him and find in him our eternal happiness. He set us apart to have fellowship with him, to be reconciled with him, to be in communion with him. And in this world, even in 1991, there are boys and girls and teenagers and men and women and elderly people who the Lord has set apart with this reason in mind, that they might know him and enjoy him and live their lives to glorify and please him. And we see here the chief characteristic of a Christian. The Lord has set apart for himself him who is godly. Of course, godly we are. We're not perfect. We're a long way from that. But we're facing in a Godward direction. Worldly means facing a worldly direction. Godly means facing a godly direction. And we weren't like that before. And this gives us a tremendous assurance. If God has set you apart for himself, if God has acted in your life so that you might know him, if God has worked in your life and changed your character so that you're more like him than you used to be, if God has done that through the gospel, if God has done that so that you might find in him your pleasure and happiness, is God going to close his ear to your prayers? And that's precisely what David says in verse 3. The Lord will hear when I call to him. We are tremendously privileged. Someone faces great distress at work. Where does he turn? We turn to God. Somebody finds himself cruelly and suddenly bereaved. Where does he turn? We turn to God. Somebody comes to the end of his life and must go through the river of death all alone, like we all will do. Where does he turn? But we don't have to go through anything alone. Ever. Not ever. Even if the world forsakes us, even if our father and mother forsake us, the Lord takes us up. It's a wonderful thing to be a believer. And David, he lives his day pleading with the unconverted to think, how long are you going to stay like that? Look what we're like. Look what's happened to us. And then he advises and corrects them. Look at now at verses 4 and 5. It's very surprising what David says to unconverted people. Did you ever speak to an unconverted friend like this? Be angry and do not sin. Now whatever does he mean? Listen. If you tell an unconverted person in all love that his values are worthless and he's seeking emptiness, and then you tell him that you are what you are because God has set you apart for himself, he'll be pretty upset with you. All right, says David, be upset. Be put out by all that I say. But don't let that lead you further from God, but rather let that lead you to God. Be angry, but don't sin. Don't let your reaction to what I say make you run away from God, but rather let this drive you to seek God. And then he says, verse 4, meditate within your heart on your bed and be still. And that's what David says to the unconverted. Take time. Take time to be still. Isn't it time perhaps someone in this church took time to be still? Isn't it time to stop and to take stock? To ask yourself, how have I lived? What am I living for? Is it true what the pastor says about the Christian life? To ask yourself questions. Now the world is very slow to be still. Very slow. It seems to me, and this is an opinion, but it seems to me that the devil is making a real effort to make sure that nobody is still anymore. We've been persuaded now that the normal thing is to get up at the last possible moment, to watch a few minutes of breakfast television, to get into the car if you've got one and put on the radio, if not, put on your Walkman, arrive at work and immediately get talking with others or read the paper for a few minutes. And so the whole day goes on And there's not a moment of stillness. There's not a gap anywhere. There's not a pause. All that militates against thinking. It militates against any serious thinking about the things of God. And David says to these men and women, stop. Be still. Choose a solitary time. Be still. And the reason that many of you don't know that God is God is that you've never obeyed this first command. Be still and know that I am God. And when people are still, even the worst of them, their own conscience is telling them that God is, that he can be known, that he is the judge, that it's time to be right with him. And so says David, approach God. Look what he says there in verse 5. Approach God, offer the sacrifices of righteousness, and put your trust in the Lord. In the Old Testament, when they came into the tabernacle, nobody could get anywhere near the presence of God. Priests had to go in for them. And animals had to be killed. And they were to understand that sinners can't come into God's presence as they are. They deserve to lose their life for the sins they've committed. But another life is laid down. And at that point they were able to commune with God. Of course, no blood of a bull or a goat or a heifer can take away sin. Killing a bird won't take away your sin or make your conscience clean. All that was a picture of the great sacrifice who was to come. Young man, young woman, for your sin you deserve to lose your life. But another life, an innocent life, has been lost, was laid down. And because an innocent life, just one, there's only ever been one, was sacrificed for sins he never committed, we may come to God. But he says, offer sacrifices of righteousness. Not just going through the form. It's not enough to cease to do evil. We've got to learn to do good. We've got to believe, but we've also got to hate the sin which has been so grievous to God all these long years. And put your trust in the Lord, he says. You can't trust yourself to get right with God. You can't do it, can you? Won't you trust Christ, who is God's eternal Son, to save you? You can't trust anybody to take care of you tomorrow and to see you safely through to the end of your life. Won't you put yourself in Christ's hands? You can't trust anybody to take you safely across the river of death to the right shore. Won't you trust the one who died and rose again and has power over death? You can't trust anyone to acquit you at the judgment. Wouldn't it be better to be friends with the judge? That's what David says to the unconverted as he lives his day. So we've seen him alone, and we've seen him with others. And now the day comes to its end, and we look now at verses 6 to 8, and here is David alone again. Here he is alone at the end of the day. Here are the thoughts which go through his head. Here are the prayers which come from his heart. There are many who say, who will show us any good? Lord, lift up the light of your countenance upon us. That might not be language we understand, but it's something that we've all seen. When you rub shoulders with people in the week, many of them are asking this question, even if they didn't put it like this. They were saying, who can make us happy? What can make us happy? What can give to life any meaning? But they don't go to God with that question, do they? It never crosses their mind that the answer lies with spiritual things. David's lived the day surrounded with unconverted people, and he's heard and seen them agitated, without peace, looking for this and looking for that, and hoping that if they have that, at last they'll be satisfied. And if they can go there, at last they'll have peace. And once they've got what they think will satisfy them, they find it doesn't satisfy them. They think if they have more money, then at last they'll be happy and contented. And all they find is that they want even more money. And so it goes on. And he sees this poor, agitated, troubled world. And at the end of the day, he's echoing all those things in his mind. And then he says, verse 6, the second half, I'm not going to look for happiness where they're looking. All I ask, Lord, for my happiness is that you reveal yourself to me. Lord, lift up the light of your countenance upon us. Don't hide your face. Let me see your smile. You've set me apart to know you. I've addressed you in my morning prayer. I can't find any happiness outside of you. And all I ask is that you won't hide yourself from me. All I ask is that you'll lift up the light of your countenance upon me. Oh, he says, verse 7, at the end of the day, what a joy it is to know you. You have put gladness in my heart. You have put gladness in my heart. My happiness, Lord, isn't tied up to my ups and downs. My happiness isn't linked in to my circumstances. It's something you have given me. And it's in my heart. So much worldly happiness is empty, isn't it? It's just an empty laugh. Because it's not a question of the heart. People get together and have a good time. They laugh long and loud. And then they go home alone. And the laugh has gone and the happiness has gone. It's all been a show. It's not been in the heart. Lord, you have put gladness in my heart. Well, how glad are you, David? More than in the season that their grain and wine increased. And now, of course, he's referring to the customs of his time. Great harvest. And they have a great party. Tremendous amount of wine, because it's been a wonderful grape harvest. And they have a great party. Everybody's happy. There's songs and dances late into the night. And David can look at that and he says, that sort of happiness isn't a patch on what I know. Not a patch. You have put gladness in my heart more than in the season that their grain and wine increased. It's a great joy to be a Christian, isn't it? It's a great joy to know your sins are forgiven. It's a great joy to know the living God. It's a great joy to know that we're His people. It's a great joy to have God's Spirit in our heart. It's a great joy when we see that heaven is real and the earth is passing. It's a great joy to see that our treasures can't be touched and can't be changed. There's wonderful happiness and joy in the Christian life. The world knows nothing about it. And so he goes to bed. Verse 8. I will both lie down in peace and sleep. What peace is mine, Lord, at the end of the day. Now I'm going to lie down in peace. And I'm going to go to sleep. For you alone, O Lord, make me dwell in safety. I know you are there. You protect me. And I'm perfectly safe. David began the day with God. David walked through the day with God. David ended the day with God. The unbeliever begins the day without God. He spends the day without God. And he ends the day without God. And now let's put an S on the end. He begins his days and spends his days and ends his days without God. Thank God we've been delivered from that, we who are Christians. How long, O you sons of men, will you turn my glory to shame? How long will you love worthlessness and seek falsehood? But know that the Lord has set apart for himself him who is godly. The Lord will hear when I call to him. Be angry and do not sin. Meditate within your heart on your bed and be still. Offer the sacrifices of righteousness and put your trust in the Lord.